Farbrengen this afternoon, but today's Shabbos is the Shabbos Bein HaMetzorim. One of the Shabbosim in the 3 weeks. Normally we know that Shabbos Bichlal elevates all the days that pass, the entire week. This is so b'negei Shabbos Bichlal, b'negei every Shabbos, not particularly this Shabbos. Rebbe went on, though we know that Ein Day Yisayim Shabbos, people are not alike, and Memela, the way it's affecting everybody, the Aliyah of Shabbos is also in a different way. This is how the Rebbe created the world, that each person should be different one from another. Von deswegen, we must say that the elevation, that the Shabbos of the 3 weeks, how this Shabbos elevates the week that passed, it's in a much stronger way. Why? Because these days, the Vachadike Tag of Bein HaMetzorim, are special days. They are days, which as the Rebbe used the expression, they are lower than the average weekdays of the entire year. Memela, the Shabbos that has to elevate these days, it's a harder avodah for this Shabbos as compared to the Shabbosim of the entire year. Why? Because these are days which are nidriker, which are lower because of the 3 weeks, because these are special days of Bein HaMetzorim as in comparison to all other Shabbosim of the entire year. Memela, we must say that these Shabbosim, it's a harder inyan to elevate the days of the week as opposed to all other Shabbosim of the entire year. And this is particularly verbunden also with the Sedras of the week, as the Sedras fall out. And we know Matos and Masei are always Sedras which are read during the 3 weeks. Matos, Masei, and as well Pashas Devarim. B'negei Pashas Matos, it's explained in Hasidus. What's the inyan of Matos? So Matos, besides meaning a shevet, which is the Pashas the title as we were discussing it in the Sedra, Mata also means a stick. What's the ruchnistic inyan of a stick? What shaykhs does this have to the heroah? All in Yonim out in Torah are there to take a heroah from it. What heroah could we take from the combination of the other types of mata? Mata meaning a stick. So Chassidus explains, look what the Torah says, if I recall correctly, the Rebbe mentioned that it comes to tell us that when it comes to Inyonik Kedusha, when it comes to Inyonim of Yiddishkeit, a person is supposed to be as firm as a stick. Just like a stick wood holds, expresses strength, the same thing, any other Inyan Ruchni, a person is supposed to hold himself as strong as a mata, as strong as a stick, and not let himself be bent and not be flexible when it comes to Inyanim of Yiddishkeit. This is the limud which we take from Parshas Matos. So Parshas Matos in itself already gives us a limud how strong we are supposed to be, what kind of a strong stand we are supposed to take b'negei Yiddishkeit. Comes Parshas Masei. Masei shows us yet more than that. What's the type of Masei? Masei means traveling. Being that we know that it always has to be Mailam B'Kodesh, and the way Hasidus explains that the inyan of the Membeis Masois, which we read about in Chumash, apply to each and every person individual. As Rabbi explained today, there are Membeis Masois, they're the way a person travels Bichlal in his life, which is compared to the Membeis Masois, to the inyan of Yitzias Mitzrayim, as well a person has the inyan of Membeis Masois in his everyday life in particular as well. Memela, this is what after Parshas Matos, how much of a heroah Matos stands. Matos teaches us how strong and firm one is supposed to stand. So we say this is not sufficient. We have to go Masei. We have to go higher and higher, because this is the inyan of Mailam B'Kodesh. That is why after Matos rather, comes Masei. Masei means a whole length of journeys. And not we stop by one journey. We keep on going continuously, a series of 42 journeys. That means that, as the Rebbe explained it, though after the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, the first stop, they were already out of Mitzrayim. So when it comes a day later, or a period later, and we're required for an additional level of Mailam B'Kodesh, so again we're considered being in Mitzrayim, until we don't go the second trip, or from the second trip to the third trip, and so on and so forth, we are still considered a Mitzrayim unless we go a step higher. So this is the Hora from the Sedra, that the Sedras tell us, both of these Sedras come one after the other, that a Yid is never supposed to satisfy himself with whatever position he's in, and though one may think he's standing in a position of a Matos. Matos means he's strong and firm in Yiddishkeit. So here the lesson comes, the Hora comes, not so, that we're supposed to constantly be an Inyan of Mailam B'Kodesh, that from Matos we come to Masay, and in Masay itself we keep on going journey after journey until we finally reach the highest pedestal of the Inyan of Yitzias Mitzrayim. Then the Rebbe went on to explain in Inyan that something which took place today by davening, and he says it's something which requires an explanation. And this is B'Negeya, the Inyan of the Haftarah. We know that we are now in the weeks of Bein HaMetzarim. In the weeks of Bein HaMetzarim, there are special Haftarahs which have to be read. Normally, it begins with the Haftarah of Matos, which is Divrei Yirmiyahu. Then we have the second Haftarah, is the Haftarah of Masay, which is Shimu Dvar Hashem. Then the third Haftarah is the Haftarah which will be read next week, Parshas Dvarim, which is the famous Haftarah of Shabbos Chazon. Now the Rebbe says, the question arises, which Haftarah should have been said today? Today is Parshas Masay, which is the second week of Bein HaMetzarim, but at the same time it is also Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. And Shabbos Rosh Chodesh has a separate Haftarah, which is usually said on Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, beginning Hashamayim Kisi. Rebbe said that there was an episode related that the Frierdiker Rebbe once told, that his father, the Rebbe Rashab, told him that he once, when the Kviyas was as it is this year, he said the Haftarah of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh came about again that the Kviyas should be the same way. He regretted how he did it the first time. In other words, saying the Haftarah of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, but rather he said the Haftarah of Parshas Masay, which is Shimu Dvar Hashem. Rebbe said this is an incident which is related to us, a conversation of two Nasiim. The Rebbe Rashab, Frierdiker Rebbe's father, was a Nasi, as well the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was the Nasi that followed after the Rebbe Rashab. So apparently he says, for what need is it? Why did the Rebbe Rashab also relate? Everything is accurate what Rabbeim speak. So for some reason, why did he also tell him that he regretted when he said the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh? Actually, he should have only told him the fact that when it comes out to be on such a Kviyas, the Haftarah, what should be said, is the Haftarah of Parshas Masay and not anything else. Why did he have to say a whole nine for that? A few years earlier he said the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh. And when it came a couple of years later and it came back to the same Kviyas, he regretted it. And we must say that everything that Rabbeim speak has some sort of a reason for it. The Meiler the Rebbe said, so we must say that there is an oath, there is reasoning also for the first opinion, which was his opinion of saying the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh. In other words, in Halacha, both opinions have a yesod. There is, as it's taka discussed in Poskim, various opinions. There is an opinion, and this opinion also has a yesod, that we should say today the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh. However, the opinion which we are to follow, which we are to do, is the way being that we are chasidim and following the directions which the Rabbeim gave us. So we are supposed to accept the second opinion, which the Rebbe Rashab said later, that he regretted the fact that he said the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh, and the right Haftarah which should be said today is the Haftarah of Shimu Dvar Hashem, which is the Haftarah of Parshas Masay. Fine. Rebbe went on. Actually, let me interrupt and say why the Rebbe got into this conversation. Today, by Mafta, at everyone's surprise, the Rebbe said last week's Haftarah, he began with the Haftarah of last week, which was Divrei Yirmiyahu. He said all of the Haftarah of Parshas Matos, and then he went on saying the Haftarah of Parshas Masay. This is what the Rebbe said today. He said this week's Haftarah and last week's Haftarah. This will clarify us a bit why the Rebbe is getting into this whole conversation right now. Okay. The Rebbe told the Meister which happened by the Rebbe Rashab. Then the Rebbe went on for 3 weeks are followed by the 7 weeks Shiva de Nechemta. Right away, beginning with Shabbos Nachmu, we have a series of 7 weeks, which each one of the Haftarahs is a Haftarah of Nechama, a Haftarah of condolence from the Rebbe to Yid. There we have the same problem would arise in Parshas Riyeh. If Parshas Riyeh would fall out on the same day as a Shchodesh Elul, then the question arises, which Haftarah do we say? Do we say the Haftarah of Riyeh, which is the Haftarah which begins Aniyah Sayar Aloy Nechama, which is the traditional Haftarah appropriate for Parshas Riyeh, or we say the Haftarah of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. Because actually, the Rebbe says, as it's discussed in Poskim, there is a reason to say that we shouldn't want to miss out one of the Haftarahs which go in the series of Haftarahs of Nechama, which is the Haftarah of Aniyah Sayar. So the question arises, which Haftarah should be said? Rebbe said, if we look into Minhagei Chabad, which is the Haftarah? Which is the Haftarah that is said as we feel that in Chabad, is that we say the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh, we say on Parshas Riyeh. What do we do with the Haftarah of Aniyah Sayara? We say it a week earlier. We say it together with another Haftarah. So what we want... Thank you. Right, thank you. Our custom is, as it's printed in the Siddur, if Riyeh with Imhu Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, Oimrim Haftarah Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. It comes the next week. That's how it is. It comes the week of Parshas Kiseitze. We add it on to the week of Parshas Kiseitze. So what actually happens is, we don't lose out saying any of the Haftarahs of Shiva de Nechemta. Why? Because when it comes Parshas Kiseitze, that is when we add it on. And in fact, if we look in, the Haftarah that said on Parshas Kiseitze is one hemshach to the Haftarah of Parshas Riyeh. So it fits in perfectly, because in Navi, it's like a continuity one with the other. So Rebbe says, what was bothering him was, let's do the same today. Let's do the same today. What way? Last week, let's say both Haftarahs. Let's say last week the Haftarah of Matos, together with the Haftarah of Masei, which if we look carefully, they are both a continuity one to the other, in Yirmiyah, in Navi, in its original source. And today, why not say the Haftarah of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh? So the Rebbe says, actually, we'll be gaining everything. On one hand, we're not going to miss out any of the parakim which we are supposed to say during the 3 weeks. Why? Because last week we could have said two Haftarahs. And today he could have said the regular Haftarah which belongs to Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. The Rebbe says he was troubled with this question. And when he was called to Maftir, this question was bothering him. Why wasn't it set up in such a way? Memela, what he did in Maftir, the Rebbe says, he's saying, Berabim, he says it should not come out to any sort of a lesson from this. He says he's saying clearly that the way he said the Haftarah today was wrong. That's what the Rebbe said. It was an error, it was a toss. Today he only should have said the Haftarah which has a shaykhis to today. However, what led him to this, as the Rebbe refers to it, toss? What led him to it was the question which was bothering him. Because the Rebbe says he was bothered with this question, why taka don't we do it that way? He says this is an inyan which requires an explanation. Why taka can't we do it today as we do it if Parshas Riyeh would come out together with Rosh Chodesh Elul? And this is really what led him to it. Rebbe went on and he said, being that it already happened, so we're supposed to take a lesson out of every inyan that happens, we're supposed to take a hero out of it. The Rebbe related that the Frierdiker Rebbe once traveled together with his father. They were away, they were not from Lubavitch, they were not at home. And it was a place where the people did not know who the Frierdiker Rebbe was, neither did they know who his father was. So the Rebbe Rashab did not expect that they should give him maftir. At home, in other words, in Lubavitch, he would get mafter every Shabbos, as the custom is that Lubavitch Rabbeim are called up to mafter. However, when he wasn't at home, and in fact he didn't even know who he was, so he really didn't expect that he should be called up to mafter. L'maisa, they did call him up to mafter. When they called him up to mafter, the Rebbe asked for a few minutes preparation time. He would walk in, the Rebbe Rashab, he went into a second room, and he looked over the Haftarah, and later he came back and he said the Haftarah as he was called up to the Torah. Later the Frierdiker Rebbe asked him, after all, say Haftarah isn't something that complicated. Why was it that you asked them to wait a few minutes and you went into the next room to look over the Haftarah, and then came back to say it? So the Rebbe Rashab told him that we're supposed to take a lesson from the Rebishter. Medrash tells us that when the Rebishter came to address Yidden by Matan Torah, Medrash says, Amra dalet pamim beinoi lebein atzmon. He said the Rebishter reviewed it 4 times himself before he addressed Yidden. And the Medrash goes on to tell us that the same is the attitude of Moshe Rabbeinu. And such a great Tana like Rabbi Akiva was also noted for his greatness and being outstanding and famous. Rabbi Akiva also, whenever he said an inyan publicly, Amra dalet pamim beinoi lebein atzmon, he would review the inyan 4 times. The Mele the Rebbe says that what do we take out of this? That when it comes to an inyan from mafter, it has to be reviewed several times, properly before. Also, the Rebbe said there's a famous expression from the Frierdiker Rebbe in the Siches that a chassid is supposed to be a pnimi. What does it mean? A chassid is supposed to be a pnimi means that when he does an inyan, he has to be fully involved in the inyan that he's doing. If a person does a mitzvah, he has to be fully involved in this mitzvah. Rebbe said naturally the Frierdiker Rebbe, when he is explaining this inyan, how a chassid is supposed to be a pnimi, he naturally does not refer by one being a pnimi and not being involved in at the same time thinking in inyanim of narishkeit, in inyanim of shtus, in inyanim of elam hazeh. Naturally we're talking about a person who at the same time when he's doing the mitzvah, he's also thinking about other inyanim shel kedusha. And this is what the Rebbe is teaching us, that a person is supposed to be a pnimi, meaning that when it comes to a mitzvah, he's supposed to be fully devoted to this mitzvah, and not to think about any inyanim, even the inyanim of kedusha, inyanim of mitzvahs, inyanim of Torah. If he's doing this mitzvah, he's supposed to be fully involved in this mitzvah. And the Rebbe explained himself, he said, when he was called to mafter today, he had on his mind the inyan of this kashem. Why can't the arrangement of the haftarahs be that, like we just explained, today to say the haftarah of Rosh Chodesh, and last week to say the haftarah Sai of Matos and Sai of Masei, which in Navi contact as a continuation one to another. The Mele being that he had this on his head, so when it came to Lapel to say the Mafter, the Rebbe said he said the Mafter a way it shouldn't have been said. The Mele something, because he's corrected himself right away. He doesn't want that any error should come out of this in future times. And the proper way, the Haftarah, which is supposed to be said today, is the Haftarah of Parshas Masei. This is the Haftarah which should have been said today. The Haftarah which begins with Shimud Dvar Hashem. This is the Haftarah that has a shaykhus today. They're mainly saying publicly and right away on the spot that no lesson should be derived from the way the Rebbe said the Haftarah this morning. And the Rebbe went on talking.
What is the between the parsha after, where you say...
He didn't answer. He didn't explain.
Still doesn't make sense because he must have prepared himself 4 times before.
Why didn't he ask the question if you say this week's parsha and also Rosh Chodesh?
It seems as though, just like we find over there, we find that when both Prakim have a shaykhus and are a hemshech one to another, we could say them in 1 week. If you look into the Chumash, you'll see that Haftarah of Matos and Haftarah of Masei are both in Sefer Yirmiyahu. The Haftarah of Matos is Kapitel Aleph in Yirmiyah. Haftarah of Masei is Kapitel Beis. So Mamela is asking, last week we could have said both Haftarahs. Why? Because really in Sefer, in its original text, they are one next to the other.
I don't understand why you didn't raise the question though. Why not say Kapitel Beis this week and the Rosh Chodesh?
It seems like a Kapitel Beis and Rosh Chodesh have no shaykhus one to another. So just like, that's why he brought the comparison like we do in Parshas Riyeh. In Parshas Riyeh we postpone saying Aniyah Sayara to another occasion when it's said with another Haftarah that's next to it in the same source.
If he's going to do anything, he should have said it then.
What was that?
Last week the Rebbe said after of Matos. But it's a quiet. But the Rebbe said today he had this shayla on his mind. Memela, this is what led him to say the after of Matos also. Then the Rebbe went on talking about the importance of inyan of simcha. That when an inyan is done, a mitzvah is done, it has to be done with simcha. He said not that, especially when you're out to influence somebody, and get a person closer to do a mitzvah, to do any inyan of Yiddishkeit, it's extremely important that we approach him with simcha. And on the contrary, if one that's out to approach is not in a mood of simcha, but he says, the Rebbe used the expression in Yiddish, he's fachmuret, which is the contrary to simcha, then we can never have an impact and an influence on anybody else. Especially the Rebbe said, as the saying goes in this country, that everything has to be done with a smile. So based on the Medrash, Azlas Lekarte, Avdis Kinimusa, when you come to a country, you're supposed to follow its minhagim. So it's extremely important that everything shetaka be done with simcha, shetaka be done with happiness, with a smile. And especially, it's not only because of Azlas Lekarte, Avdis Kinimusa, but based on the pasuk, Oiz v'chedva ben koimai, that when we do in Yonim of Kedusha, in Yonim that have a shaykhas to the Reifish, that has to be joined with chedva, with happiness. Here the Rebbe later the Maisa, which the Gemara says, told the Gemara, that one of the Amayroim, after putting on film, was in great happiness. So he was asked by another colleague of his, why is he so happy? How are you talking he's not happy? We know that the Gemara tells us that Bizman Hazeh, we're not allowed to we're not allowed to be at such a high madrega of simcha. So how you talking? He asked him, how come you're that happy? So he told him, but what I did was tefillin not here. The male being that he just put on tefillin, so the putting on of tefillin brought him to such a tremendous mood of simcha, to elevate him so, it brought him to such a level of joy, that something which normally we know that but this raised him to such a tremendous mood that he became moli simcha, became full of happiness, that he was mamale pivsroik, something which ordinarily a person even has to stay away from. Why do we see that when we get close to a yid and we want that a yid should put on tefillin or bring a yid close to any other mitzvah, the way to approach a yid is only with simcha, and by approaching yid with simcha, this brings about that our approach to another yid has an effect. And Memele, whatever we request from another yid to bring him close to any particular mitzvah, the mitzvahs in general, when it's done with Teich Simcha, it has a hashpah on the person or people whom we're trying to utilize the hashpah on. Then the Rebbe went on, especially that at times we may be able to approach a person who never put on tefillin in his life yet. And this person until now was considered a kakafta de lo monach tefillin, a head that has never had any tefillin on him. So we're rescuing this person, we're saving him, we're bringing him to become a ben olam haba by the fact that we're bringing him to put on tefillin. Then the Rebbe explains a Zoya from his father, and he said this Zoya has a shayches also to the Inyanim of Beis HaBchira, to the Inyanim which the Rebbe requests strongly that we learn during the period of the 3 weeks and the 9 days in Inyanim that have a shayches to the Beis HaMikdash. So this Zoya from his father, in other words, it's an Inyan, it's a beer in a Zoya, but simultaneously it's also an explanation in an Inyan which deals with Beis HaBchira. And this week's Seder and Parshas Maseh, the Rebbe says there are no comments from his father in Zoya. And mainly he selected to learn an Inyan which is in Teiras Levi Yitzchak, where his father explains an Inyan that has a shayches to Masechta Midas, which is the Masechta that talks about Beis HaMikdash. And there his father explains that there was a lishka, there was an area in the Beis HaMikdash which this area was set aside for the Kohen Gadol, with the Kohen Gadol suite in the Beis HaMikdash. So he discusses that this Lishkas Kohen Gadol had several names. In other words, it was referred to by several titles. One title was Lishkas Ha'etz, the Lishka of wood, the Pashat HaTayich. Another taich would be Lishkas Parhedrin. And another third one would be Lishkas Palvati. And he goes on to explain what shaykhs does the area of the Kohen Gadol have to all of these three names. Rebbe said there are some that explain what's the shaykhs, why was it referred to as a Lishka Shaleit, what shaykhs does it have to wood. It wasn't constructed out of wood, they claim. So what shaykhs does it have to wood? They explain that it's talking about Kohanim Gdolim in the second Beis HaMikdash. In the second Beis HaMikdash we know that the Kohanim Gdolim were not as they should be. They weren't acting proper. Memele, they were seated in a lishka, which this lishka was called lishka shel eitz, because just like eitz, just like wood, has a tendency that it rots. Memele, this was for the Kohen Gadol, a siman that served the purpose of a constant reminder to the Kohen Gadol that he should remember that he should behave properly. Otherwise, it reminded him on the union of rotting. Rebbe said it's very hard to accept this pshat. For various reasons. The one that, when we find this explanation, we find it in the Tosfos Yontif. Before the Tosfos Yontif, in Rishonim, we don't find this explanation in the union of Lishka Shaleit, and it's very hard to accept such type of interpretation. And there were in Yonim done in the Beis HaMikdash to remind the Kohen Gadol, especially we know that the Kohen Gadol was separated from everyone 7 days before Yom Kippur. He was separated to be aside to prepare himself for the Avodah of Yom Kippur. As the Gemara tells us right away at the beginning of Masechta Yoma, and they were in Yonim which were done to remind the Kohen Gadol that he's supposed to act properly, but to say that the area he was seated in was called Lishka Shaleit. For this reason, the Rebbe says it's very hard to learn that one. An explanation why it was called Lishkas Parhadrin. So here in Teras Levi Yitzchak, he quotes from the Gemara in Yoma that Parhadrin means a person who was memuna ala shvokim, a person who was an appointee on the streets. And these appointees would be changed every couple of months. Every year they would change the appointees. Excuse me? Shvokim are markets. So the person who was memuna on the markets, on the shvokim, the memuna ala shvokim was changed every couple of months or every year. In the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, we know that the Kohanim Gdolim were not marich yomim, because they weren't Evlech Yidin, they weren't as it should be. The Mela, we know that if a Kohen Gadol wasn't as it should be, he didn't live through the year. He wasn't Moitzish Nosai. The Mela, just like these, I'll get to it in a minute. Just like these Parahadrin are appointees that are changed often, the very same as the Kohen Gadol. And then they go on to the third explanation as well, for why it was called Lishkas Palvati. When it said, this is what his father discusses in the Zohar. The emes is that these Kohanim Gdolim had a tremendous, they very much wanted to be Kohanim Gdolim. So they came to the kings, who themselves were also not tzaddikim, and they paid them off large sums of money, so that they should be appointed as Kohanim Gdolim. The Rebbe said if the king would have been a tzaddik, then the king wouldn't have accepted the bribe to appoint him as a Kohen Gadol. So during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, we find there were a large amount of Kohanim Gdolim, because either that the king constantly kept on appointing new ones, or simple that the old one wasn't Moitzish Nosai, so a new one had to be appointed. And these were positions that, as said in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, they were bought from them. In Rambam we find, Rebbe says, we find in the Rambam says, that the Rambam discusses the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, that nothing was built with wood in the Beis HaMikdash. Wood was not used in the construction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Ravid, who's known, who argues many times on the Rambam, says, how can we say so? How can the Rambam say so? At the time we know that there was a Edras Noshim, there were other areas in the Beis HaMikdash which were constructed from wood. So we see that this is already a machlokes between the Rambam and the Ravid, whether there were areas in the Beis HaMikdash which were constructed of wood, if wood was used for the construction of areas in the Beis HaMikdash or not. Those that claim that it wasn't, they base it on a pasuk. So they interpreted that kol eitz, any type of wood, was not allowed to be used anywhere in the structure of the Beis Hamikdash. Let's do it later. Let's leave questions for later. The Rebbe went on to explain that what we see actually is that there were areas in the Beis Hamikdash, as the Raiver asks, there were areas in the Beis Hamikdash which were constructed out of wood. Memela, this takes away the reasoning. Those that claim that we can't touch Lishka Shaleit with a Kohen Gadol suite in the Beis Hamikdash cannot be referred to as a Lishka Shaleit. Why? Because no eight was used in construction of the Beis Hamikdash. Here we see that it's basically dependent on a machlokes of the Shainim. It traces back to a machlokes between the Rambam and the Raiv. Rebbe said, we cannot learn Pshat, as mentioned earlier, that the reason it was called a Lishka Shaleit was because just like eight is Roikev, just like eight rats, the same way it serves as a reminder to the Kohen Gadol. On the contrary, Beis Hamikdash was only there to remind in Yonim Shel Tov, good in Yonim. The Mela the Rebbe says, why was it called Lishka Shaleit? So Sfara brings a pasuk in Yeshaya, Ki Yimei Ha'eit Yimei Ami, which shows that on the contrary, that eight is a sign of Arichos Yom. So we see that the whole idea of, as he, in the Kutel of Yitzchak, he explains that the whole idea of the Kohen Gadol, Kohen Bechlal is in Yonei Chesed, and the Kohen Gadol is in Yonei Chesed as well. So a Kohen Gadol and a union of Kahuna has a Shaychus to Arichos Yom. We cannot say that it's called eight. Why? To remind on a negative thing, to remind on a union of rotting just like eight rats. On the contrary, why was it called Lishka Shaleit? The Rebbe's father explained, because just like eight, there's a pasuk, Yimei Ha'eit Yimei Ami. The same thing, the Kohen Gadol is there to pile an union of Arichos Yomim. That's the union of a Kohen Gadol. Explaining this union, the Rebbe said, we see two very interesting nekudas in this thing, what has transpired here. The Rebbe says it's a meirabike thing. We're talking about people who are not proper, people who are not as it should be, people that go to such an extent that they know they don't deserve the appointment of a Kohen Gadol, and they pay off money that they should be appointed as Kohen Gadol, and many of them don't even live 30 years. Why? Because they're not acting properly. Still we see that these type of Yidden, at the same time, had such a strong desire, such a strong hamshacha to be able to enter the Kodesh HaKadosh, and there was something within them. On one hand, these people weren't proper. They were not Eloch Yidden as it should be. On the other hand, we see that they had a tremendous anxiety within them, a tremendous hamshacha, something within them that see them that they wanted to enter the Kodesh HaKadosh. And for entering the Kodesh HaKadosh, they were willing to pay extraordinary sums of money. They were willing to risk their lives as long as they should be able to get one thing to the Kodesh HaKadosh. So we see, the Rebbe says, from here we see how valuable and precious each and every Yid is. Even these Yidden, when we look at them, on one hand that they didn't act proper, on the other hand we see they didn't act proper, but to what was their desire? What did they want? They wanted to go to the Kodesh HaKadosh, and that doesn't take it. That's one point we see from this. Another Nekuda the Rebbe explained. The Mother tells us that when Kohen Gadol, the begodim which he wore when he did the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, the Mother says v'inicham sham. Pasuk says v'inicham sham. So the Mother says pshat. What's pshat v'inicham sham? That these begodim which he wore while doing the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, he wasn't allowed to wear the same clothes again next year. V'inicham sham, he had to leave these begodim there and put on new clothes when it came to do the avodah again on the next winter. What's the pshat in this? The Rebbe explained. Begodim are a meaning of a levush. We know that there are levushim and ruchnius as well. Pshat is that the avodah which was done in one Yom Kippur, whatever way the Kohen Gadol did the Avodah on a Yom Kippur, it comes next Yom Kippur, it has to be with a different approach. In other words, in Ruchnius, there's no Indian of repeating the same Madregas. In other words, in Ruchnius, the Pshat is, he has to bring himself up to a new Madregas, something which he wasn't at last year. I mean, it's reflected in a halacha that he has to change the begadim. But it doesn't just mean the halacha, it means something pneumistic as well. It means that the levushim of a person, which are levushim, this is how he serves the Rebbe. Every person has his levushim, as explained in the Chassidus, the machshava dibur ha'mayis of a person, these are his levushim, and this is how he's an Oved Hashem. The Meilet comes to tell us, v'yinicham sham. This year he served the Rebbe with these levushim, with this approach. It comes a berayot, comes a f'naim yor. He has to create within himself a new level, a new madrege, how to be able to serve the Rebbe. And it comes to the Avodah of Yom Kippur, cannot be done in a repetitious way as he did the Avodah last year. There's no meaning of repeating. He has to refresh himself and approach the Rebbe in a different way, with new levushim when it comes to do the Avodah again in this Yom Kippur. The Rebbe again spoke today very strongly and urged everyone to learn in Yonim, whether it's in Navi Yecheskel or it's in the Rambam or in the Masechtas, Midas, in Yonim that have a shaykhis to Beis HaBchiron. By learning these in Yonim, the Rebbe said, this helps in the building of the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash should hasten the building of the Beis HaMikdash. We can do this by learning, especially in these days, in Yonim that have a shaykhis to the Beis HaMikdash. Then the Rebbe went on, as usual, learning a Rashi, explaining a Mishnah and Ovis. And also the Rebbe spoke about later another inyan which we will get to, that today is the Yortzeit of Aaron HaKohen. Today is Chodesh Shav. In fact, it's a pasuk in today's Chazarah as well, that today is the day when Aaron HaKohen passed away. The Rebbe said that he can relate the good news, the tremendous news, that already it has reached the number of children that are needed for the writing of one Sefer Torah. Rebbe said there are 304,000, a little more than 304,000 letters in the Sefer Torah. He says, Baruch Hashem, it's tremendous inyan shel simcha to him that we have already reached this number of children, and this number of children are already taking part in the ECS of the Sefer Torah. And he also added that he hopes that as it stands now, the Sefer Torah will be finished already in the Chodesh HaChamishi, in the 5th month, which is the month of Av. And the month of Av is the Mazel Ari, the Mazel of a lion. As Yidden are compared to an Ari. And Mele is asking now that everybody should take part, to see to it, to reach out to as many children that after writing the first Sefer Torah, should be able to be continued in the writing of the second Sefer Torah, and reaching out to more children, those children who have not taken part in the first Sefer Torah, they should have an ois, a letter, in the second Sefer Torah, which will be written after the first one will be completed. Then the Rebbe said, as usual, he says that sometimes he explains in Inyan in Rashi, which Rashi is mefarish. Sometimes the explanation is on an Inyan, which being that Rashi's Inyan is to be mefarish, Pshutu Shel Mikra. So wherever a question arises in Pshat, Rashi should say Pshat on it. So in this week's Seder, the Rebbe says we find an Inyan which obviously requires an explanation from Rashi, and for some reason Rashi doesn't say it. Where is it? It's in Parshas Masei. Pasuk talks about the Ori Mikra. Pasuk tells it after Hamishi. In Hamishi is Masei.
Lamed Hey?
Yes, Lamed Hey. So the Rebbe tells us that Ori Mikra should be made. The Ori Mikra were made. 3 Ori Mikra were in Ever HaYarden, and 3 were Mizrach on the other side of the Ever HaYarden. Then the Pasuk tells us in Pasuk Vav, V'sa'orim ashatitnu l'Alviyim, Kapitel Lamed Hey Pasuk Vav, the cities that would be given to the Leviyim, Sheish Ori HaMikrot ashatitnu lo neshama ha'retzeach, these 6 cities would be considered cities of the Leviyim. And besides these 6, you also had to give additional 42 cities to the Leviyim. And as it goes on in the next pasuk saying that the Levium had a total of 48 cities which was given to the Levium. So the Rebbe asked, we know that on the other side of the Yarden, it was Shevet Gad, Shevet Reuven, and half of Shevet Menashe that settled on the other side of the Yarden. What was the reason? So we find emissaries that they begged Moshe Rabbeinu that being that Anshe Mikne, they had a lot of cattle, and they found that the area there geographically was suitable for cattle, and they begged that they should be able to stay on the other side of the Yarden. And as we read about in detail in last week's set, comes now, the Rebbe says, Pasuk tells us that these 6 cities of refuge, of which we know of a Miglad, of which we know that 3 were on the other side of the Yarden, these cities belong to the Levium. What for? Why did the Levium need cities? B'chlal we know that the Pasuk tells us in Parshas Korach, that and it's explained in Halacha as well, that the inyan of a Levi is that a Levi has, his inyan is to serve the Eibush. All the descendants of Shevet Levi, that it's Kohen and Malavi, and their inyan was to do the Avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Other than that, they were to have no other interest, no side interest. The Mela here we find something strange in the Pasuk. The Pasuk tells us that the 3 cities on the other side of the Yarden was given to the Levium. What for? For what reason was it given to the Levium? The Levium weren't in need of cities. And particularly, after we know that why did the Yidden, what was the reason for the Shevet Gad and Reuven, Choti Shevet HaManashe, that they wanted to settle on the other side of the Yarden, was because Mikne Rav Hayu. They had a lot of cattle, so they found out areas suitable for them. What shaykhs does it have to Levi? Levi didn't have Mikne Rav. There was no need for, what was the need for Levi? To get territory on the other side of the Yarden. This is what the Rebbe asks. So obviously this is a question that stands up in Pshuta Shel Mikra. So Rashi should have commented on it. And we don't find that Rashi should make any comment on it. As well, the Rebbe said, we discussed last week, the idea of Milchemes Midian in Parshas Matos. So there it's also told that what the Yidden brought back from the Biza, which the Yidden brought back from Milchemes Midian. So the Pasuk tells us, "Vayiten oisam lalviim shemre mishmeres mishkan Hashem kashetziv Hashem es Moshe." It was given to the Leviim. This goes back in Kapitel Lamed Aleph, after Chamishi. Pasuk Mem Zayin. The Rebbe says, same question arises over there. For what need was it that the Leviim should get this? I mean, it seems that they got something not as an equal share together with all of the Yidden. They got something besides what all Yidden got as an equal share in the Biza. They got something more than that. The Shaila is why? Why were they supposed to get something more than that? Especially when we know that the Inyan of the Levi is Ein lo yalav ela Hashem elokov. The Inyan of the Levi is that his Inyan is to have a share only in the Inyanim of Karbonis and the Inyanim of Beis HaMikdash. This was the Inyan of the Levi. So why here do we find that the Levi got a special chelik of the Biza which was gotten in Milchemes Midian? The Rebbe explained that Enoch and Ameh, that the Levi's Inyan is only in Yonim that have a shaykhs to the Lakus, to the Rebishta, to get like the Levi has no shaykhs with in Yoni Yoilam. But if we look carefully in the Psukim, in Parshas Matos, the Pasuk says, Vayiten oisam lalviim, and then the Pasuk stresses, Shemrei mishmeres mishkan Hashem. For what need is it for the Pasuk to tell us what the Leviim are doing here? Here the Pasuk isn't discussing the duty of the Leviim. This is not the Inyan. From that, when the Pasuk throws in a line, you know what the Leviim doing? They are Shemrei mishmeres mishkan Hashem. Why is the Pasuk stressing this? Because the Rebbe is explaining. So we must say that the diuk is, why is this given to the Leviim? Because they are Shemrei mishmeres mishkan Hashem. In other words, this is something like a truma. Just like they get truma, just like they get meiser. Truma and meiser, the inyanim that are given to the Leviim. This also is an inyan which was set aside special for the Leviim. Not the pshat. On one hand, the Leviim are not doing anything other than servicing the Rebishter. Hakim mitzad them, that they are not doing anything other than servicing the Rebishter, just like they are getting Matanis Kohuna and Matanis Leviim, especially in Yonim, which are supposed to be given to the Kohen and to the Levi. The same thing, there's a special part of the Biza which was gotten in the Mechemes Medium, which the Rebishter said, this is a hero show, this is something special, which only came about at that time, which should be given to the Leviim. Not the Pshat. What the Rebbe said, not the Pshat is an union of Gzeiras HaKosu. There's reason for it. Reason for it is just like the Rebbe said that the Leviim should get constantly matanis during all the times. So here, when it came a special occasion, the Rebbe gave something special to the Leviim. The same way, the Rebbe explained the cities in this week's Seder. It's not the Pshat that the Leviim got it, just like Shevet Gad and Shevet Reuven, the half of Shevet Menashe. They got cities in the other side of the Yarden for the simple reason, would they needed it. Rebbe didn't give it to the Leviim because of the kettle which the Leviim had, or any other side reason it was given to the Leviim, just like we find many in Yonim which the Rebbe gave Matanis, the Kohanim and Leviim. The same thing is what they're saying. Then the Rebbe went on to explain a Mishnah which is recited in today's Perek. Today would be Perek Sheni, the second Perek in Pirkei Avos. The second Perek in Pirkei Avos, at the very end, we find the saying of Reb Tarfon. Tarfon tells us, Perek Sheni, at the very end, one Mishnah before the last. Hayom Kotzer says it's a short day from Malacha Meruba, and there's a lot of work to do. V'apoyelim atzelim, the workers are lazy. V'asocha haben, there's a big reward. A balabai is doichik, and the balabas is rushing. Pressing. This is one mission. As the Rebbe always stresses, Reb Tarfon Oimer, meaning it was a constant saying which Reb Tarfon would often say. So firstly, the Rebbe asked, this Indian must have some sort of a shaykhs to Reb Tarfon. Because if he always said it, it must have some shaykhs then. Then we find the next Mishnah. Who hayoim? He would say. Who is this he? Naturally, it's Reb Tarfon as well. What does he say? Don't be worried. You're not the one that has to finish the entire job. On the other hand, you're not free to get out of it completely. If you learned a lot, you're rewarded much. Don't worry that Eibishter is bagleit. We can believe him that he will reward us. Then he also adds on, here he's out to say, you can see people that are doing the right thing and still we see they are not rewarded. So he said, don't be worried, because the Eibishter rewards tzaddikim loss of love in the world to come. So the Rebbe asked, actually these Mishnahs have very similar contents one to another. So why was it that the Mishnah had to be broken up into two Mishnahs? First Mishnah Tezvav should be Rebbe Tarfon. Then it comes to Mishnah Tezayin, it begins another Mishnah, Hu Hayoim. Could have done one Hemshach, Mishnah Tezvav in continuation with Mishnah Tezayin. Then the Rebbe asks furthermore, if we look carefully, we see that Mishnah Tezvav and Mishnah Tezayin, which are both sayings of Reb Tarfon, contradict each other. And Mishnah Tezvav, Reb Tarfon tells us, you should know it's a short day, Chaparein, Hayoim Kotzav, Amalocha Meruba, you have to Chaparein as much as possible. It comes to Mishnah Tezayin, he says, you're not the one that has to finish the job. It's completely contradictory to what he told us in Mishnah ago. In Mishnah ago he says, you have to do as much as possible. Now he says, do it slowly. You're not the one that has to finish. You do yours. And somebody else will do his, and that's how everything will be completed. But he's telling you right away, this is a complete stira to Hayom Kotzav HaMelacha Meruba. A minute ago he rushed us and he said, Chaparein, do as much as possible. Now he comes in the next mission, he says, no. You do what you could. And what you can't will be completed by someone else. Also, the Rebbe asked, if we look carefully into Mishnah Tesvav, first he says the day is short. There's a lot of work. Expression should have been fakir. Hamalacha merubah. There's a lot of work and the day is short. That's the right way to put it. Malacha merubah v'ayoyim kotzer. He doesn't do that, Rab Tarfon. He says fakir. Ayoyim kotzer v'amalacha merubah. Let me explain. Basically, Pirkei Avos is for Milah de Chassidusa. Pirkei Avos comes to tell us in Yonim, which if not for, that it was in Yonim v'shtei, are not mentioned b'ferish in Shulchan Aruch. Something additional, Milah de Chassidusa. So the first thing Rab Tarfon begins, Hayoyim kotzer. You should know that whatever we're required to do al pi din, al pi Shulchan Aruch, you have to do as much as possible. Hayoyim kotzer, chaparai. Hamalacha merubah, he's already adding something new. Hamalacha merubah, he's talking, besides what we're obligated to do mitzat Shulchan Aruch, Milah de Chassidusa, Pirkei Avos, adds much more malacha, adds much more work which we are supposed to do. Puts much more on us as if without Pirkei Avos. In other words, Milah de Chassidusa is an additional burden. This is what he's introducing by saying Hamalacha merubah. And then he goes down, and so. So Tarfon makes a cheshbon. If so, personal here, that there's that much to do, he has to do what he's mechuyev al pi din. Besides what he's mechuyev al pi din, there's a tremendous amount of Milah de Chassidusa, which he's also supposed to do, which Pirkei Avos has introduced him to do. So a person will see that he has a tremendous amount of work. And he'll realize that he hasn't accomplished his work. The male person may come to brokenness, may be completely broken. It could lead a person to years. He'll see that he has that much to accomplish, and he hasn't accomplished what he's supposed to, so it'll break the person completely. So Tarfon comes for these people that realize times where they make a total, when they make a sachakal, they realize looking where they're standing, and they see that they haven't accomplished as much as they should. Memela breaks them. And they come into a feeling of yush, they come into a feeling of being lost. So Tarfon was cautioning these people, you should know, don't feel bad. That's why he's coming in a separate Mishnah and says, you are not the one that has to finish the entire job. In other words, the fact that there's that much to do shouldn't break you, shouldn't lead you into yush. If, as discussed in Mishnah Tesvav, a person makes a total and realizes Hayoyim kotzer v'amalacha merubah, and he hasn't accomplished everything which he should, mainly there are some people which this may have an improper effect on them. It may affect them may lead them to a tremendous feeling of yush, to a tremendous feeling of brokenness. They will say, they can't accomplish anything. So Tarfon says, no. For these people, he also has an advice. This is why it comes in a separate Mishnah. If the fact that Hayoyim kotzer v'amalacha merubah is bringing you to a feeling of yush, don't let that break you. You should do what you could. That's what he's introducing and teaching us in Mishnah Tezayin. But at the same time, you should know it's takaloy alecha malacha ligma. You are not the person that has to finish everything. But you cannot say that you'll get out of it completely. You have to do what you could. You do your share, and by doing your share, you'll see as much as possible. Then the Rebbe went on that today, as mentioned earlier, today is the Yotzeit of Aaron HaKohen. Yotzeit of Aaron HaKohen. Aaron, we know, was very famous for Avas Yisrael. We know, Mishnah tells us, Havei mitalmidav shel Aaron HaKohen. Aaron lived very long, lived for a long period of time, 133 years. When Meila, the Rebbe said he was more than Marich Yomim, so he accomplished a tremendous lot in his life. So Mishnah tells us that we're to follow the footsteps of Aaron. Oyev Shalom, Roidev Shalom, Oyev Esabriyah, Sumekarnon LeTorah, bring people close to Torah. Follow all, the Alter Rebbe in Tanya Perek Lamed Beis also explains whatever we can derive from Aaron's life. The Rebbe says it's extremely appropriate now in the days of Bein HaMetzarim, because the Gemara tells us that the reason why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed was because of Sinas Chinam. So Mamela, the idea of Avas Chinam, Avas Yisrael, and as it was practiced by Aaron HaKohen, this is something which would bring back the Beis HaMikdash to us. This is something which will hasten the Geula, something which will rush the coming of Mashiach. Rebbe says we find an interesting thing in the Rambam. The Rambam is a sefer of halacha. Rambam in Mishnah Torah, as the Rambam himself writes in the introduction, that his sefer is halachas. It's not like Medrash or Gemara we find in Yonim that have no shaykhs to halacha. Whatever is mentioned in the Rambam is extremely accurate for in Yonim of halacha. We find the Rambam in Hilchas Chanukah. The Rambam in Hilchas Chanukah discusses how Hallel was recited in Chanukah. And then it was recited a little different than we say Hallel today. Yes. And it was in the system that there was somebody that the Shliach Tzibur would be saying, and everybody would be answering Hallelujah. And this is how everybody would join in and saying Hallel by responding Hallelujah. So the Rambam says that the Kohol would respond 133 times Hallelujah during the recitation of Hallel. 123. The Rebbe kept on saying 133. That's what he kept on saying. I don't know. Then the Rambam goes on. Yeah, but he kept. Then the Rambam goes on and he says, "V'simonach." The Rambam will give you a siman. What's the siman? Keneged shnei simei. The siman is as long as Aaron. Rebbe said it's extremely strange to find in the Rambam which is a halacha sefer. The Rambam is telling us al pi halacha how Hallel was supposed to be recited, and in Echanam it was 123 times the Hallelujah. What shaykhs does this have to as long as Aaron lived? Has no shaykh, obviously. And male, if it would be in a medrash, it would be in another type of a sefer. It's no other sefer other than the Rambam. And which sefer of the Rambam? The Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, which is the Rambam himself writes. This is the halacha. The halacha sefer. And here the Rambam finds it appropriate to give us a siman. How many times Hallelujah was said as long as Aaron lived? The Rebbe went on to explain, Bichlal, this is the inyan al pi halacha, it's the idea of Shemeya Ke'oineh. We find it many times in Shas that there's an inyan of Shemeya Ke'oineh. If one listens, it's considered as he would say along. Memela, here the same thing, by listening to the Chazan saying Hallel and responding Hallelujah, it's considered as everyone would say Hallel himself. And so we find, by Birchas Kohanim, we find an inyan that, in fact, it's set up to such an extent that the bracha which the Kohanim make, when they make the bracha on Birchas Kohanim, in other words, it's extremely important, and it's even a tnai in the mitzvah, that when the Kohanim bench Yidna has to be done with ahava, it has to be done with love. In other words, a Kohen that does not have ahava to Yidden cannot go up and bench Yidden. When could he bench Yidden? Only if he has the ahava. Mela, the Rebbe went on. The idea of Hallel is a praise to the Eibishter. The emes is Shemeya Ke'oineh. The Rebbe said we find it many times. We find many halachas where the halach of Shemeya Ke'oineh goes on. However, Hallel is something exceptional. Mara says, Kolo'ima Hallel b'chol yoim ha'reize mecharif, ha'reize megadif. In other words, Hallel should not be said every day. Why? Because every day we don't see nisim gluyim from the Eibishter on a daily basis. However, when we see a nes golui, we see something out of the ordinary from the Eibishter, which the Eibishter goes out of the routine set up as the world is being run up iderech hateve, and the Eibishter does something outside of these rules. That is when the inyan of Hallel is required. This is an inyan of a nes golui. A nes golui, this is what requires Hallel. Remember, the inyan of Hallel is something also which comes about, which comes when there's an inyan begolui, which shows the Eibishter did something special for Yid. Remember, it's an inyan of a nes golui, which shows that the Eibishter's love for Yid. Remember, that's why the Rebbe said it's very appropriate that the Rambam should give a siman, the simon of keneged shnoisev shel Aaron. And where does the Rambam give this siman? in an Inyan which has to do with Hallel, but just like the Inyan of Hallel, when is Hallel recited? Where the Rebishter showed an extra Inyan of Ave to Yidden, the Rebishter went ahead and performed a Nes, something which is not done usually. He performed an Inyan Shel Nes outside of the regular way, the way the Rebishter runs the work from day-to-day basis. He performed a Nes, an Inyan Shel. The Rebishter expresses his Av of a Chibah to Yidden. That's why he performed this Nes. The male, it's very appropriate. Aaron, who also symbolizes the Inyan of Ave. This is the Inyan of Koyanim. Koyanim, their Inyan is Levorech Esama Yisrael B'Ahava. As well as particularly Aaron himself, who expressed a very huge amount, an unlimited amount of Avas Yisrael. This was in Yoni Shal Aaron, as the Mishnah says. Aaron's Inyan was Oyev Shalom, Roidev Shalom, Oyev Esabriyas and Makarvel L'Torah. Memele. That's why when the Rambam discusses the procedure how Hallel was said, and the Rambam finds that Hallel had same number of Hallelukos were responded by Yidden as the number of years Aaron lived, it's most appropriate that the Rambam here should give a siman v'semonoch k'minyan shneis of Shalayim. That's why the Rambam, when the Rambam discusses Hilchas and Hilchas Chanukah, when he describes how Hallel was recited, this is why the Rambam ties it in to the Neked Shneis of Shalayim.